And we are unbelievably delighted to be joined by our special guest, Dr. Russell James. I will introduce him more in a moment. But before we do, I just want to say that we are thrilled to have Russell. I hope it's okay that we occasionally skip the honorific of doctor, but so excited to have Dr. James, who I think is sort of widely seen as the most important researcher in modern American fundraising, and certainly has a global aspects to the work as well. So a lot of a lot of folks here joining from Canada, occasionally from South Africa, Australia, the Philippines. A lot of this work is going to be really useful. And I think one of the things that stands out about Dr. James is, there are a lot of smart people who you sort of know they're smart. But I think there are a couple of attributes that are extremely important and a real reflection of people that are actually, close to brilliant. And one is a level of understanding what is important that often might seem mundane or uninteresting or not catch the eye of others. And to really figure out what is the thing that really, really matters and focus on that. And I think you'll see that is a big part of Dr. James's work. And the second is, how do you take some of this stuff that might be mundane or complicated or sort of legalese or some of the academic research and break it down to a level that's actually useful to most of us who don't think in peer-reviewed paper speak. And I know that, I've read some of the peer-reviewed papers. And so, Dr. James can talk about p-values and throw in 1,000 footnotes as necessary. But most importantly, it has really changed the work and careers of a lot of people by being able to make this widely accessible across the board. So we will be handing you the torch in about 5-10 minutes. So feel free to stay on video or not, up to you, whatever is necessary. And do a little bit of housekeeping, a little bit of intros, and then we will hand it to you. So we're so glad to have you here. Quick note for all of you, this event is CFRE approved for 1.0 credits. We will add a question to the survey at the end of this. Just make a small note there to certify your participation. And basically the way this works is we keep rough records, but it is all self-reported. And if you ever get audited, we will be here to back you up. So here's a quick agenda rather. Most important thing to know is that the recordings and the slides will be sent around later today. So some of you will learn best by furiously taking notes. Some of you might prefer to sit back and drink coffee or tea and watch us all unfold. Both of those are fine, whatever works best for you. And we will be sharing this as well. So quick introductions of me first. My name is Patrick, lucky to be the co-founder and co-CEO of Free Will alongside my beloved co-founder, Jenny, pictured here. And we are lucky to be joined by more than 200 folks. We've raised more than $7.5 billion in bequest commitments and various types of gifts for nonprofits to date. At this point, we get to work with about 1,100 wonderful nonprofit partners, from the biggest in the world to small local animal shelters. And we get to learn from all of them, which has been such a joy. And one more thing before we get started, we just really value your time, and we're so glad that you're here to join us. And so one of the things we like to do is give away gifts that are usually some of my favorite books. So as you can tell by the bookshelf, I've read a lot of these. I really find a lot of joy in learning from other people. One of the best books that I've read on creativity, on innovation, on research is by Stephen Johnson. And it's a book called Where Good Ideas Come From. It's the history of innovation. And so we often hear about good ideas, but we don't really understand why they happen, or how does a field advance year over year, decade over decade. And so this is really interesting. It's sort of a scientific study of innovation, but sort of like I was talking about Russell a moment ago, Stephen does a great job of breaking it down into really accessible information. So even if this has no bearing on your professional work, which is not true, you'll really enjoy it as a read. And so just make a note in the survey at the end of this session, and please include your address so we can actually send it to you. So that's that. A couple other things before we hand over the mic to Dr. James. We asked you how your week is going, and sort of you can see some ups and downs lately in terms of how happy people are feeling, how anxious people are feeling. And so just something we'll keep an eye on going forward. It's a pretty normal fluctuation. The other thing that was pretty interesting is, we're really doing this confidence measurement week over week to understand how we as a sector are feeling about hitting our goals this year. And you can see, we started out really good. In the course of the year, things got a little bit darker at the end of last year, and then really starting to bounce back. And so it's nice to see there's some positive economic news, some other things happening. I think we're seeing a lot more giving. A lot of people were surprised at how well end of year went, given economic uncertainty. We probably won't talk about this much, but some of that has to do with the rise of donor advised funds, which a lot of people are seeing as a little bit of a smoothing effect on giving year over year. So we're happy to talk about that at a different time. All right, but without further ado, I'm going to introduce my dear friend and industry colleague, Dr. Russell James, who may or may not be wearing the same vest in this picture as he is today, same tie. This is remarkable. I assume this photo is several years old. Professor of Charitable Financial Planning at Texas Tech University, as well as, I believe, teaching about financial planning. Worked in the 25 years plus working and researching the nonprofit sector. Among other things, I think a former trust and estates attorney, former university president, which many people don't know. And as I mentioned, probably the most influential academic researcher on the topics of planned and major giving, certainly, possibly in all of fundraising. Among other things you might not know about Dr. Russell James, you would be impressed to find out that he runs marathons. You would be more impressed to find out that he runs often 100-mile races. And so the level of tenacity and hard work that he's brought to our sector to make all of our jobs easier certainly got into a couple other hobbies as well. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you don't have to suffer through Dr. James telling me every time he wants to change slides. Russell, I believe that you'll be able to easily share your own screen. So feel free to take it from here.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Well, I really appreciate that, Patrick. And we talked about what Patrick wanted me to share. And so basically, here's what's going to happen. I teach 2 semester-long courses on charitable decision-making. One is on major gifts and one is on planned gifts. And so we're just going to do all 2 semesters of that material here in about the next 40 minutes. So hang on, because we're going to be covering a lot, essentially all at once. And the first topic we're going to look at is this idea of non-cash giving and the importance of non-cash giving. And so I want to start with a concept from behavioral economics. I teach a graduate course in behavioral economics, and one of the core concepts that is useful in that space is referred to as mental accounting. This actually was a term coined by Richard Thaler, who a couple of years ago won the Nobel Prize in economics. And so this is a very simple concept that says people attach labels to financial assets, and then they treat those assets differently based upon those labels. Now, what this means for fundraising is really important, and that is this. Most people will think of charitable giving only as something that comes from their disposable income. That is, charitable giving is a pocket change decision. It compares with what they just spent at Starbucks. If you have a donor who already cares about your cause, the single most powerful transformation you can make with that donor is to get them to begin considering their wealth, not their disposable income, but their wealth as donation relevant. And we're going to look at a number of ways in which that comes up in real world research findings. And so one of the things I want to mention is I use that phrase planned giving, but in actuality, when I'm trying to convince somebody inside the organization about that phrase, I don't use that phrase. Instead, I will talk about major gifts of assets, because that's something that is actually much more attractive to organizational insiders, even though technically it also includes all of these concepts from planned giving. If you're going to ask for a major gift of an asset, you need to understand that a donor can avoid capital gains tax by giving that appreciated asset rather than by selling it and giving you cash. And then we can leverage that through all sorts of complex instruments. It's very powerful that we have these asset conversations, these wealth conversations with donors, because it changes the reference point. When we make wealth donation relevant as a matter of mental accounting, it changes that reference point. And so when we're talking internally, we're talking about major gifts of assets. Now, some of those may come through planned gifts, some of those may come through gifts and wills, but these are all gifts that do not come from disposable income. And this actually does come into this idea of gifts and wills, because for most people, the very first time they will ever commit to a charitable gift from their wealth, not from their disposable income, is when they make that commitment in a gift in a will. So let's talk about some research findings. And so I just want to start out with what I think are the two most significant research findings that I've ever published. And I believe that they are telling us exactly the same thing. Now, one is this. We did an analysis of over 1 million nonprofit tax returns, looking at over a 6-year time period to see what predicts long-term fundraising growth, that is long-term contributions growth. And what we found was that one of the most powerful indicators was whether or not that organization was including gifts of non-cash assets in its contributions along with cash, in particular, gifts of securities, real estate, stocks, bonds, that sort of thing. Now, just to give you a quick example as an excerpt from that, if you had two otherwise similar organizations raising at least $1 million a year, and one of them, both at the beginning of a 5-year period and at the end, was raising those gifts only from cash, that cash-only organization, their combined total 5-year growth would have on average been 11% in contributions. Now, that 11% contributions growth is identical to the combined rate of inflation over that 5-year period, which tells us that cash-only organizations are essentially treading water. Now, if you compare that to organizations both at the beginning and at the end that were also including gifts of non-cash assets like securities, those organizations on average grew their contributions at an average of 66%. So one of the things I want to point out here is that as an academic researcher, I'm used to, publishing research that has the appropriate p-value, but it's really the difference between somebody given, $8 or $9.20. This is not that. This is showing a 6-fold effect on long-term contributions growth from one single factor, which is whether or not that organization was including gifts of non-cash assets such as securities in their contributions. Now let's talk about gifts and wills. This is from a large nationally representative study out of the University of Michigan that's been going on for over 30 years, and it represents all U.S. adults over age 50. And what you're looking at here is for those individuals who added a charitable component into their estate plan, it compares what their charitable giving was before they made that estate planning addition and what it was after they made that estate planning addition. So what you see here is on average, we get a 77% spike in current giving after the person completes that estate plan. Now, keep in mind, these are the same people on the left-hand side in the white bars as compared to the right-hand side with the black bars, but their behavior changes dramatically. Now, you remember what I said about for most people, the very first time they will commit to a gift from their wealth rather than their disposable income is with the gift in a will. And one thing I can tell you about a gift in a will, regardless of its size, is that is not a gift of disposable income. And once this wealth becomes donation relevant, we see a fairly dramatic transformation in the giving. I'm a stats guy, so there's lots of different ways to look at this. You saw that the averages went up about 77%. We could also look at this in a way that's not influenced by outliers. just the propensity to write checks of $1,000 or more, that actually goes up substantially. And in fact, I had a friend of mine that worked at a university and said, well, we're only interested in folks that can make at least $50,000 pledges over 5 years. So I went and ran the analysis for the propensity to make gifts of $10,000 or more, and we actually found that that effect was even stronger than just the average giving effect, and it continued to strengthen over the years. So that is why we want to talk about gifts and wills, because we want to talk about gifts of wealth. Now, how can you convince your board to be interested in these non-cash assets? Well, I will tell you about the time that they allowed a tenured professor to speak to the Texas Tech Foundation board. By the way, if you're at a university, don't ever do this. We can't get fired, so we're complete wild cards, and you never know what we're going to say. So here's what I did. I looked at the IRS Form 990s, which are publicly available for all nonprofits at some of our competitor or similar organizations. Go to Schedule M as in Mary, and found an outstanding organization comparison. Now, I made this presentation before the pandemic, and these were the numbers I showed them. I said, hey, this is what we're doing, and this is what our competing organization, Iowa State University, is doing. And we were doing about the same in cash, but we were completely getting our butts kicked when it came to non-cash assets. That, let me tell you, is highly motivational for the organization insider. By the way, another reason why we're interested in these kinds of gifts is fundamentally, this is how wealthy people give. They give a much larger share of their total philanthropy in these estate gifts as compared to lifetime giving. So notice when we're looking at that annual giving to estate giving multiple, and this data comes from IRS tax records, we see that that multiple grows as wealth goes up. So if we're interested in mega gifts, we need to be interested in these gifts and wills. So what do these bigger gifts look like? Well, I'll give you a bit of a hint. It's always been the same answer. Large gifts have always come with lots of instructions. In fact, in 2 studies of wills from the 1800s, charitable bequests were restricted in only 14% of small cash gifts, 58% of real estate or large cash gifts, and in 70% of gifts of a share of the entire estate. Now, this isn't actually a surprise. We know from experimental research that when you allow donors to put instructions with their gifts, it increases the size of those gifts. Now, when it comes to estate gifts, what is the most extreme version of gift instructions we have today? It is the private family foundations, funds, and trusts. These are pages of detailed instructions controlling the gift for decades or even generations. And by the way, going back to 2007, when our estate tax exemption was less and we could see smaller estates, for estates of $5 million or more, the share of charitable dollars going to private family foundations was 70% in 2004 and actually 78% in 2007. So you got to understand the competition. The competition involves massive detailed instructions that come along with those donor funds. And public charities, they're only getting 22% of these charitable bequest dollars. So it's important to know what motivates these dollars. So, by the way, how can we get into these larger gifts when we're talking about our own donors and those charitable gifts in wills? Oftentimes you have fundraisers that will say, well, they've said they've included us with a gift, but they don't want to tell us how much it is. And I'd like to know how much it is. And frankly, I'd like to know how to make it bigger. How is that possible? Well, let me suggest this to you, that if we help that donor to define a personally meaningful victory by our conversation, it can motivate not only revealing the gift size, but also increasing the amount. Conversation starts simply, something like this. if a donor indicates they've included your organization with a gift in their will, that is so exciting. I am so honored that you would treat our organization like one of your family. I can't tell you how much we appreciate that. By the way, have you ever thought about how you would like that gift to be used? Well, the reason I ask, and oftentimes the donor won't, the reason I ask is this. I was working with another donor, and you remind me of her. You both have many of the same values. And what she decided to do was to include a gift in her will that one day will create a permanent endowed professorship here at the university to guarantee somebody will always be doing research in this particular field. Now, those started about $2.5 million, and I didn't know if that was so that's a bit more than you were thinking of. Well, you know, a lot of our donors like you really enjoy setting up a permanent endowed scholarship fund. You can name that for the family or a particular loved one, and you can set the rules on which students will receive that. Now, that started at about $50,000, and I didn't know if that was something. Okay, you see what we're doing here? We're moving beyond the gift in a will, yes, no, and we're now giving a reason for the larger gift. We are helping that donor to define a personally meaningful victory. So when we are talking, in particular with insiders, about these gifts and wills and plan giving more generally, we want to get the story right and the statistics right. And the story, I think the key element is this, that we want to focus on gifts from wealth, not disposable income. Major gifts of assets is the terminology that is more persuasive. We need to focus on the competition that's winning, which is that private family foundation. The statistics show gifts of assets drive near-term fundraising growth as well as long-term. Gifts and wills drive near-term fundraising growth as well as long-term. And frankly, it's how wealthy people give. So we need to be able to make these kinds of gifts. Now, let me switch topics here to the second topic we're covering. I told you we were going to be going fast today. We're going to be looking at some words and phrases that we like to use when having these conversations. When we're having conversations about major and planned gifts, what words do we use? And of course, all of these slides are going to be shared. Patrick mentioned that. If you like this stuff, connect with me on LinkedIn. Everybody who's connected knows I share all my stuff for free, all my books, my slides, my videos, at least the digital copies of the books. I mean, if you want to kill some trees, you can go on Amazon. Happy to share all that with you for free. So one of the core principles that we get out of all of this phrasing testing is, number one, we want to keep it simple and use story. I like to call it use family language, not formal language. Now, what is family language? That's stories and simple words, or simply, would you have said this in a normal conversation with your grandmother? The answer is yes, you're using family language. If the answer is no, you might be getting into formal, legal, or contract terms. This is market language, and the problem with market language is that it triggers a market or exchange frame of mind. And that market or exchange frame of mind actually does not encourage sharing. Let me share with you a handful of results. Here is one where we randomly assigned people to two different descriptions of a charitable remainder trust. The descriptions were identical except for the first few words. I've blown those up here, but they were all the same color and same size in the actual experiment. And then we asked people if they were interested now in this kind of a gift. And notice we almost double the share of people who say they're interested now in the gift if we describe that charitable remainder trust beginning with the phrase, make a gift, as compared with beginning with the phrase, make a transfer of assets. So the more simple language works better. Here's a different test we did. We randomly assigned people to two different descriptions of the charitable remainder trust. The only difference was in one of those descriptions, we called that charitable remainder trust charitable remainder trust. Just using that formal technical insider phrase to describe this vehicle when we're initially introducing it actually substantially reduced people's interest in that charitable giving arrangement. We did the same thing with the charitable gift annuity. And again, when we're throwing in those financial formal terms, those insider terms that we like, rather than just describing what it does, we dramatically reduce interest. And we see that with all types of formal terms here. And so, for example, bequest gift will not work as well as simply gift in a will. We did do an analysis to see were there some groups, older, younger, men, women, there are some groups for whom the technical terms were worse, but they were bad for every group. So there was no groups for whom it was a good idea to use the more technical term. Another thing that's very powerful, especially when it comes to gifts and wills, is social examples. People like me do things like this. One of the most powerful pieces of research that's ever been done in this space was actually 3,000 people going through their normal estate planning process. This was using a law firm in England that does a high volume of over-the-phone consultations. Unbeknownst to them, people were randomly assigned to one of three groups. One that got no specific reference to charity, one that got one extra question, would you like to leave any money to charity in your will? And one that got that question with the extra phrase, many of our customers like to leave money to charity in their will. And what we found is that single phrase, many of our customers like to leave money to charity in their will. And by the way, that was the phrase that generated all the results, not the second sentence that you see there, because I split them apart and tested them. What you see is we get a more than threefold effect from a single sentence in the estate planning process. Now, this tells us a couple of things that are really important. One is to keep in mind just how fluid this charitable estate planning decision is. If you've got a major lifetime financial charitable decision that you can more than triple just by your phrasing, you've got a highly fluid decision. It also lets you know what happens if we're not top of the mind when donors are making that kind of a decision. Notice just asking the question more than doubled those who are including charity in their will documents. It's not that those other folks were less charitable or didn't want to leave a gift. It just wasn't top of the mind, which tells us something about the importance of being top of the mind. By the way, not only did this have more than a threefold effect on the share of real people putting real gifts in their actual will documents, but the average gift size for that third group was more than twice the size of the other two groups. So you're talking about literally a six-fold effect from a single phrase, a single example. Now, I wanted to go ahead and test that in the US. We see the same results here in the US. Many people like to leave a gift to charity in their will, bumps up those results or those answers. All right, I'm going to get on my professor soapbox here, something that drives me up the wall. And this is when you will get bad advice from well-meaning folks. And generally it starts with this. You'll have a consulting firm that says, we want to find out why people give. So they will send out a survey. Why do you give? And they'll have options like, I give because of my values or my beliefs, or because I want to make an impact. I want to change the world. And one of those options will be, I give because I want tax benefits. And they'll get back their surveys and say, oh, nobody checked the box that they give because of tax benefits. So therefore, don't talk about the tax benefits. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Now, in social science research, we know that we can't test those things this way. If you ask people for their motivations, you're going to get the socially desirable motivations. Certainly, we can see from empirical data that tax benefits matter from national tax data, but we can see this a different way. In this study, we just randomly assign people to one of three descriptions of a charitable gift annuity, one with no reference to the tax benefit, one with the reference to the tax benefit put at the end, and one with it brought to the beginning. And notice how we get a rather dramatic increase in the share of people who are interested in that gift. We randomly assigned people to these descriptions, but just to make sure we didn't get lucky, we then spun the wheel and had the bottom group is now assigned as the top group and vice versa in this description of retained life estate. If you don't know what that is, I've got a series of 65 free videos that go through all of planned giving. Connect with me on LinkedIn and I'll send them to you. But we see the same result. Identical descriptions, no reference to tax deductions, reference at the end, reference at the beginning, we get a higher level of interest. We spun that wheel one last time, and here you see for a charitable remainder trust, no reference to tax benefits, bring that reference almost all the way to the front, and then bring it all the way to the front. And we see this as well in a different study with a different group where we ask people about their interest in making a gift of stocks or bonds to charity. Was dramatically higher in when we said avoid capital gains tax by making a gift of stocks or bonds to charity. Now, in another study, we actually weren't asking people about their interest in the gift. Instead, we asked them to rate their level of interest in reading more about this topic if they were on their favorite charity's website. And it turned out that there wasn't any magic phrase to describe it as long as we did describe the tax benefits. So notice avoid taxes by giving stocks did the best, did a little bit better than avoiding capital gains taxes by giving stocks. No surprise there. Every time we can use more simple language, we're going to get better results. Now, by the way, this was, we also in this study tried to find out what is the best front door phrase to get people to read about planned giving information. What do they want to read about? And it turns out that if we call it gift planning or planned giving, almost nobody says they really want to read about that. But if we call it other ways to give smarter, we get about a 6-fold increase in the share of people who say, yeah, I want to read about that. Well, as you know, it's not enough to get people to click. We've got to make sure it's not just clickbait, that we're actually giving them what they expected. So we asked them, which of the following types of information would you expect when you clicked on that button? And we asked them about 12 different types of planned giving information, gifts in your will, in your living trust, life insurance, death beneficiary, IRA, TOD, bank account, TOD, avoiding estate taxes, and so forth. Here is the overall average for all 12 types of planned giving information that people said they expected. And notice that if we say other ways to give smarter, they're actually just as likely, or compared to planned giving, more likely to expect that broad range of information. But if we call it gift planning or planned giving, they don't want to read about it. If we call it other ways to give smarter, they want to read about it, and they're expecting to see what we want to talk about. By the way, how should you share information about making a gift in a will? In this case, we tested a bunch of different phrases to see what people were interested in reading about when it comes to gifts and wills. And it turned out that anything referencing gifts and wills worked better than anything using the term bequest gift. But we know gifts and wills are narrow. What about broader estate planning terms? So here we looked at a bunch of different phrases: will planning, legacy giving, planning with trusts and estates. And it turns out that people were more interested in will planning than in legacy or estate planning. By the way, why is this? There's actually some interesting focus group research that was done by Professor Adrian Sargent. And what he found was that many people, when you start using terms like estate or legacy planning, they feel like, oh, that's for other people. The terms are a bit too grand. You know, people with estates like on Downton Abbey that go riding their ponies across the Vale in the morning, right? That's not me. But a will, everybody needs a will. Now, the challenge is, as an estate planning attorney, I can say, but wills are really narrow. There's all sorts of things in estate planning that aren't narrow. What about what other approaches can we use? So in this case, we tested starting with gifts and wills and then using the long list. That actually worked better. So we didn't get too much of a reduction in interest by adding those other examples, trusts, retirement accounts, or life insurance, as long as we started with the topic of gifts and wills. Again, we ask people, when you click on that, what are you expecting to see? Are you expecting to see information about wills and living trusts and TODs on life insurance and TODs on IRAs and bank accounts? And we actually got a pretty weird result, which is that when people clicked on gifts and wills, they were just as likely to expect information about living trust, life insurance, IRAs, TOD on bank accounts as when they clicked on the term estate planning. But if we called it estate planning, they actually didn't want to read about it. This then turns to another issue about what job titles work best for gifts of assets. So we tested this and asking people in a variety of different scenarios, who at the charity are you more likely to contact? So we tested 71 different titles, every title I could find or get my hands on. And the first scenario, we said, suppose you receive $100,000 in corporate stock from a relative. You're considering gifting some of these shares to a large charity, but you want to do it in a way that saves the most taxes. Who at the charity are you more likely to contact? Now, I'm not going to give you all 70 results. I'll just give you the top 10 and the bottom 10. The best titles all involved some reference to donor guidance or advising or planning. They're basically saying, I am here to help the donor. The worst possible titles you could have, anything using our technical insider terms like advancement or development. How big is this difference? I gave you the top 10 and bottom 10. Well, here's the share of people who would definitely contact this person for help with a gift of stock as compared to if they're called a director of donor advising, a director of advancement. Well, we actually more than triple the share of people who would definitely contact by calling that person a director of donor advising rather than a director of advancement. And we also more than triple the share of people who say, I would never contact that person when we start using our technical insider terms. Here is another example. We asked, suppose you own some real estate, you're thinking about giving part of it to a charity, but you want to do it in the right way. So now we're not even referencing taxes. We're just referencing do it in the right way. What are our worst 10 titles? They're all the same essential titles: advancement, development. By the way, number 10, you see there, Chief Donor Ombudsman Officer. I am particularly proud of that because I made that up because I thought it wouldn't work at all. So I'm very happy that it made the bottom 10. I'm a little less happy that to this point, I have not demonstrated sufficient intellectual capacity to construct a title that is worse than what we all use. We also asked this question with regard to a gift and a will. Similar answers there. Not only did the worst 10 stay about the same, the best 10 included anything referencing estate planning, legacy planning, but also more generic titles that say, I'm here to help the donors, like Director of Donor Guidance, Director of Donor Advising. So if you put them all together, we get this same basic list of the top 10 and bottom 10, very similar for the oldest adults, very similar for women as compared to men, not a big difference there. Even among major donors, those that are giving $10,000 or more in donations, we see similar lists that are taking place. Anything that says, I am here to help the donor works. This isn't a super complicated idea when you think about it. It's really just asking this question: do we communicate with donor language or do we communicate with insider language? Whenever we communicate with that insider language, it doesn't work as well. Now, I want to end with just a couple of minutes on some statistical topics here of racial and ethnic diversity in planned giving. So one of the things that we see is that we don't have a huge difference in racial and ethnic propensity to include a charitable gift in an estate plan once you get the document. This is looking at people who have will or trust documents and the share among those age 55 and above who include charity. There's a bit of a difference. Actually, the wealth differences would suggest that difference should be even greater. But here's where the massive, massive gap occurs. That gap is in the share of people who have estate planning documents. This is where the massive gap happens. And so if you were to simply ask the question, what is the propensity to have a charitable estate plan, you would see this massive, massive gap. But that would ignore where the real problem is. The problem is not in the propensity to include charity once you have an estate planning document. The gap is in having those estate planning documents. So I love to get all statistical wonky. Let me share with you from the Law Review article what the bottom line is on this. Basically, that those negative associations between minority, racial, and ethnic status and charitable planning, they completely disappear when including only those who have documents, or even controlling for the probability of having documents. This tells us that that initial difference is driven entirely by estate planning documentation. We actually see, unfortunately, lots of other research finding that minorities can have access to formal legal services. And so this is consistent with other research that we've seen. One last thing I want to mention to you here is that another nationally representative study actually looked at this question in a different way. It asked people, how important is it to you to include this kind of a gift in your estate plan? So one of the questions was asked, how important is it to you to leave an estate or inheritance to a church, synagogue, mosque, or religious organization? And notice we do have substantial differences there, comparing non-Hispanic Black, non-Hispanic White, and Hispanic individuals. And what we see is that the non-Hispanic White are dramatically less likely to be charitable, at least when it comes to religious gifts. If we look at everything else, this was a separate question asking about leaving an estate or inheritance to charity. What do we see? We see that same idea. So what is this telling us? This is telling us that we have an extraordinarily high level of philanthropic intent, but that is combined with a substantial documentation barrier. And it is that combination that is resulting in this lack of expression of this philanthropic intent in actual signed and witnessed will documents or other effective estate planning documents. So very powerful things to keep in mind there when we're thinking about the effects and some of the opportunities that are available there. Well, Patrick, I didn't want to go over my time. I am a professor and a lawyer, which means if you don't interrupt me, I will just keep talking and talking for 2 or even 4 semester-long graduate courses that I teach online for anybody who just can't get enough of this stuff. But I want to stop there and turn it back over to you for some additional thoughts and comments here, Patrick.
Amazing. So first of all, thank you so much for that. I assume you're not following the chat in real time, but really eye-opening. A couple of things that stood out to me. One, that idea around, non-cash giving being by far the most important driver of revenue growth. Nothing else that we've seen in the research comes anywhere close, besides maybe a single enormous gift from Miss Scott or something else. But generally, that this is just incredibly powerful. Second takeaway, that it was sort of interesting. I was talking at the beginning of this call about how you do a great job of breaking down complex stuff into simple terms. And it turns out that one of the most important lessons that you have is for all of us to do the same thing. We teach a writing class every 6 months or so. And one of the real standout research pieces is how much better people respond to things written at a 8th grade level compared to a high school level compared to a college level. And sometimes everyone will ask, well, what about my donors? My donors are extra smart. Nope. Everyone is more responsive at an 8th grade level. So I'm going to share my screen. We'll do a couple of closing notes, and then we will open up the floor for Q&A. So if you have a question, please note that now in the Q&A portion, not necessarily the chat, because there's so much going on there. So a couple of things. And I wanted to share a couple of resources with you all. So one of my colleagues, and maybe Amanda, maybe Phoebe, I'm not sure. One of my wonderful colleagues is going to drop a note in the chat now. Thank you. It's Amanda. Thanks, Amanda, to fill out this survey. And we normally ask you to do it. We would like to extra ask you to fill this out today. A couple reasons. One is this is where our gift, the Where Good Ideas Come From book, will get selected. Two, as I think many of you reacted, there was a ton of awesome information from Dr. James, and we'll make sure we can share the slides with you and the recording. So there are a lot of your coworkers who now, by the way, need to change their titles, their job titles, or do other things differently, and you'll really want to have that for them. The second thing I want to note about this survey, which is why it's much more important than usual, usually pretty important, is that we at Free Will are finalizing some groundbreaking new research. And what we are doing is we're wrapping up our 2023 Donor Advised Fund report. It's the first time we're doing it. We're looking at attitudes across the sector. We're looking at some of the early findings from what happened in 2022. And we really need about 100 more responses to wrap this up. Right? We need to get to some statistical significance, make sure they're accurate. It is probably a 3 to 4 minute survey. So when you get to that link, you'll see 5 questions. And when you do those 5 questions, you'll get redirected to this more official research survey. We would be so grateful if you did it. It'll be, it's a personal favor to me and to Free Will, but it's also the case that it's a huge help to all the other peers on the call, right? And so we'll send the report out to everyone who participates. We'll share it more widely, but it's really helpful for folks who are running their own program to understand what challenges are you facing? What is unique to me versus what is the whole sector doing? How are we thinking about it? So if you can take just a few minutes in doing that today, just know that we'll be really grateful, and it will mean a lot to us, and it will really help a lot of other people in their careers. And so fill that out, and then you'll be redirected to the research survey. So thank you so much for doing that. One other announcement. On Thursday, so in a little bit less, probably exactly 47 hours from now, I'll be walking through folks who are interested in the planned giving suite. We try not to talk about Free Will a lot on these, but if anyone wants to join, just make a small note in the survey and we'll send you a calendar invite, and we'll do a little bit more in 2 weeks as well. And yeah, so please, if you haven't already clicked through the survey, please do that now. And we will also dive into some Q&A. So Russell, I hope it's okay if I fire some questions at you.
Yes.
A couple of them are about, folks that sort of share your opinions and are trying to do some change management internally. So Angela says, I've tried everything with our board of directors to give a major gift of assets. I haven't had any luck. How do you think about really talking to our leadership about this to help change strategy?
Sure. So I will tell you, number one, go ahead and take a peek at the 990s from any similar organizations. If you can find a superstar organization, and again, that's Schedule M as in Mary, that is bringing in those non-cash assets, nothing you say is going to be more powerful at that board level to say, here's what organization X is doing. Here's what we're doing. This is opportunity that we are leaving behind. So if you can do that, then do that. The second type of approach is to try to talk the philosophy of how once we get that first gift of an asset from a donor, whether that be a $10,000 gift of stocks or we get a gift in a will, a planned gift in a will, that can be transformational because now we're shifting from pocket change decisions to wealth sharing decisions. And so sometimes you can convince them of that philosophy. By the way, if you have a legacy society already, don't only use that UC Davis Law Review study and show them that chart. Actually run this analysis for your organization. Nothing is more powerful than to say, here's what our donors were doing before they joined the Legacy Society. Here's what they do after they join the Legacy Society. That will get attention. And I've got to tell you, every organization that I've got to run this analysis internally are coming back to me saying that they're seeing much more than a 77% average increase in charitable giving.
That's really smart. Similarly, Kelsey had a question. Some folks here are from St. Jude or the Red Cross, and some folks are from much smaller organizations. Kelsey says, how can young organizations with limited expense budgets set themselves up to receive non-cash gifts, considering the cost of brokerage accounts, the complexity, et cetera? Do you have any input on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an answer that is massively different today than it was 20 years ago. And that is regardless of what valuable asset, as long as it's valuable, don't talk to me about timeshares here, that the donor wants to give to you, the answer is always yes. Now, in many cases, the answer may simply be absolutely, we would love that gift. We'll just need to run that through a donor advised fund, and I'll walk you through that process to show you how that's done. Now, you can start, if you would like, with your local community foundation. There are, of course, the financial institution donor advised funds, but there are donor advised funds set up to literally take any kind of valuable asset. I mean, everything from a partial interest in a racehorse to unharvested crops to, in one case, an elephant ride business in India that had to be held for 3 years before it was sold. Yep, there's a donor advised fund for that. So you don't have to have that expertise internally. You can work with, again, I always recommend starting with your local community foundation, but you can work with organizations that will do that complex side for you.
Yeah, that's great. I'll also put a small plug in that Free Will has a smart giving suite, which actually helps people, especially organizations newer to this, get rolling in stocks and QCDs and donor advised funds and other things.
That should have been my answer. Apologies for that, Patrick.
That is okay. Kelly asks a question. She says, we shy away from heavily detailed plan gifts in a will. In years past, very detailed gifts to specific funds have gotten us into some trouble because the program is no longer functional. We've done a lot of strategic planning. We've changed some things. What are your thoughts on how to balance these specific instructions with future flexibility for a gift that may be 2 years away or maybe 20 years away?
That's exactly why you need to get involved, because if the donor's just putting their own instructions with those gifts, a lot of times those are instructions that you're not going to be able to follow, and so you'll end up losing the gift. But if you can take part in helping the donor to build those instructions, then you can build instructions that do have some flexibility, that have some language in it on this is our intention, this is our expectation, that are not necessarily something that you're going to regret later coming in, and make sure the donor knows that they are not being bound to this gift. This is simply you saying what you would expect to do with it when those funds come in. I've just got to tell you that if you want the larger gifts, one of the things that we see again and again and again and again is that larger gifts come with instructions. The Mackenzie Scott gifts were not large gifts for her. They were highly fragmented, tiny little gifts, and that's why they didn't come with instructions. Large gifts relative to the donor come with massive instructions, and that's why you get things like private family foundations that take the massive share of these dollars, because that gift instruction, that story, is actually what is compelling for the donor, and you very much want to be involved in the construction of that story so that it doesn't go wrong, because you now know how to do it better and can help the donor to set those story guidelines and those rules or instructions with the money.
That's great. A couple more questions. Ryan has a question, which is a little bit of a joke, but also a really important one. He said, now tell me what the best phrases are of going to my boss to tell them they have to change their title. How do you address those conversations? Now the research shows it's actually really important. We wouldn't have thought that makes such a difference, but it might be the difference between hitting your goals and missing by 15%.
So what I would say is that actually your job titles serve several functions. So one purpose of job titles can be to allow the organization to speak back to itself, okay? But when you're looking at your donor facing, that's when you want to use donor words, not insider words. If you can't get your job title changed, then I would just say, like if you're using the old business card or the email signature, instead just add a phrase under your job title that says, I help donors give smarter. Now, that's going to trigger a question. That's going to trigger a conversation. Those are the kinds of conversations that you want to have, where you can share stories of what other people like the donor have done that involve these interesting gifts. If you're into tax planning, it might be an example of what somebody else did that was a smarter way to give. Or if you're not, it might be an example of an endowment or some other type of gift that has a really interesting story with it.
Really smart. Some other maybe rapid fire questions before we wrap up. Was there any research around using the word philanthropy in a title? A couple of people asked that.
Yeah, absolutely. So philanthropy comes out right in the middle. Wasn't horrible, wasn't great, just kind of a meh title.
Got it. Great. Other questions. Was there any data on South Asians or East Asians as we look at will, proclivity to give, things like that? It may not be.
There isn't yet, but I have a PhD student who's working on that for her dissertation. So as much as I can push her to move faster, we will get those results out when that happens.
That's great. And a few folks suggested also making sure that we include mixed race as an option there, as that's obviously an increasingly
So that
large
actually
part.
comes completely from the national data sets. That's not something we can control. So whatever happens to be in that national data set, that's what we're stuck with using.
Makes a lot of sense. Okay. One question for me, so I'll answer it. Katie says, we are considering free will at our organization. How does free will leverage marketing and offers to customers to include things like social proof and these other language ideas Dr. Russell brings up? I will say that we learn from him all the time. And so it's a mix of that and getting in real time the ability to test some of this language, because we work with small nonprofits, large nonprofits, probably representing across the board, maybe 20, 30, 40 million Americans. Really fun to do some of this research across the board. And so we've done a lot of studies on what promotes giving. We also did this really interesting research around what promotes people who give to tell you that they're giving, because that's a big problem in planned giving. Sometimes people don't let you know they made a request. And the answer there was something like, will you make the job of nonprofit employees easier by telling them so they can count this towards goals and make plans? And it's actually, people actually just want to help you personally, not just the mission, not just the institution, but you, the good person working there. So that was cool. I'm going to find one last good question. Oh, that's a great question. Ty asks, what interested you originally in philanthropy and charitable giving as a career specialization? As a lawyer, as a smart person in America, you had a lot of options. Why did you choose this route?
Oh, I wish I could give you a really inspirational tear-jerking story. I'm sorry, Patrick, I don't. I was in law school. I took tax law. I ranked the course. I took estate tax planning. I ranked the course, meaning I got the highest score in the course. And I realized that, hey, maybe this is something I should do. So I went and worked, had an estate planning practice, worked in planned giving. And then, as you mentioned, was a college president for several years. And honestly, and that was a very fundraising focused role. And when that was over, my career goal was to not be anyone's boss. I just wanted to do teaching and research, and that's what I've done ever since at the University of Georgia, University of Missouri, and now here at Texas Tech University.
That's great. There are definitely days where I dream about not being anyone's boss. Well, listen, 2 thank yous as we wrap up. One, Dr. James, thank you so much for sharing this. But also thank you for doing all the hard work that went into this. Like the coming here for an hour is the easy part, but lifetime of learning and study and research, along with, I assume, many people who helped you. So, for all the other students and anyone else who helped in the research, make sure that they have our gratitude as well. And then the second thank you is for everyone who joined today. We're so grateful that you spent an hour with us to really push your own career forward, your own work forward. The money that you're raising is so wildly important, and really is what's driving a lot of our planet forward. And so thanks for doing it a little bit better. And really glad to have you here. If you haven't already, please fill out that survey. But in any case, thanks so much. Quick preview in 2 weeks. We are going to dive in on Gen X. So some of you will recognize this iconic movie image personifying Gen X from, I believe, High Fidelity. And we're going to dive in on sort of effective fundraising strategies for a forgotten generation. I think this is your generation. Is that right, Russell? In Gen X? Yep. We talk so much about boomers. We talk so much about millennials. And oftentimes this gets neglected. So we're going to dive in on some of the best research there. Oops, oh, something else happened here. And last thing is, if you have creative ideas to share, if you need anything at all, you can email me at patrick@freewill.com. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. You can also find Dr. James on LinkedIn. He does share some really great stuff. So delighted to have you here as well. And just thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful week. Look forward to seeing you either on Thursday or in 2 weeks. And thanks again, Dr. J.
Thank you so much, Patrick.